This book was conceived and written in the late years of the 1950s, an epoch that has variously been called the Jet Age, the Detergent Decade, the Second Industrial Revolution. Our accession to almost unlimited supplies of energy is balanced against the possibility of making our planet uninhabitable. But this again is balanced, as we stand at the threshold of space, by the growing possibility of quitting our island Earth and letting down roots elsewhere. Even a man who does not possess an electric razor is likely, in the westernised world at least, to dispense some previously inconceivable product, such as an aerosol shaving cream, from an equally unprecedented pressurised container, and accept with equanimity the fact that he can afford to throw away, regularly, cutting edges that previous generations would have nursed for years. Even a housewife, who does not possess a washing machine, dispenses synthetic detergent from synthetic plastic packs onto synthetic fabrics whose quality and performance makes the jealously guarded secrets of silk seem trivial. The average automobile of today, running on such roads as have been especially contrived for it, provides transport more sumptuous in vehicles more gorgeous than palanquin-born emperors knew how to desire. And it goes on and on and on like that.
He likes it. Hello, everybody. This is George Ginjal.
This is Luke Jones.
This is About Building Cities. Special request episode.
We are on to Reyner Banham at the request of you, the listener, or at least a selector.
Bunch of you filtered through a poll. I knew almost nothing about this topic.
Yeah.
Until I had to do a lot of cramming for this episode. So
it's funny because he's someone that I've definitely heard of in lots and lots of contexts, but I think I'd decided I didn't really like, and then had decided not to learn very much about either.
Yeah, one can put a lot of people in this category because there's just a lot of people out there.
But I think the listeners have sort of struck gold in a way. I think that there's an awful lot to talk about here, and he's got a lot of dimensions as a character.
Yeah, this is definitely, by the way, going to be a romp.
Yeah.
I suspect a two-parter, but we are going to be covering and in man's entire life work, which consisted mainly of written stuff over a couple of episodes.
Yeah, famously 12 books, 700 articles. The books, though, crammed into quite a short period when he was doing one about every 18 months. Well, for those of you who never heard of him before, Reyner Banham was variously a critic, an architectural historian, interlocutor, promoter, and also condemner of contemporary architecture in his day. Started off in Britain, but became well known on what was then the world stage of modern architecture and modern architectural history. Known above all as a great lover of technology. If he had one project above all, was trying to work out how technology could be placed at the centre of contemporary architecture as a kind of concern.
And also for a short film on BBC Two about why he loved Los Angeles.
Yeah, that's the one. We've got quite a lot to get through before we get there.
Which is probably not even going to be in this episode at all, by the way. There's a lot of his career before then.
What we were saying early on, that he is a bit of a podcaster in a way. You know, he's like definitely doing that sort of high-low culture, high-low-brow culture, pop culture thing, which now is sort of ubiquitous and basically the register of all cultural criticism, but at the time was very much his thing.
Yeah, although in a way I also think at the time you could get away with a more open style of academic writing than you can now.
Oh yeah, no, that's certainly true.
The academy has
closed
up remarkably.
Yeah, he's also a huge character, someone who places himself as a character at the heart of all of his.
Yeah, fancy dresser. No stranger to a purple silk cravat.
Both, incredibly dated, and I think also very much a sort of contemporary model of a type of intellectual output, actually.
He took sides.
And he had a sort of way of ranging around and a way of locating himself, which to me feels like, not like a contemporary academic, but very much like a contemporary cultural writer or intellectual.
Yeah, except that unlike them, he seems to do more homework.
Yeah, sure. We're very much in sort of groovy London of the 60s for a lot of this.
But before we get to the groovy London of the 60s, we can be in the crap Norwich of the 20s and 30s.
Yeah, that's where our story begins. The quote we heard was from his first major big work, Theory and Design, in the first machine age, which was his doctoral thesis, which he wrote from about 1952 and which came out, I think, in 1960.
Born 1922 in Norwich, son of a gasfitter. I don't know anything about his mother at all. The women in his story are totally obfuscated.
There's this kind of part of his self-mythologization is that the Banhams are all technology men.
Yeah, he did say that. He lies a lot about, well, doesn't lie, but he lies and self-mythologizes.
When I was listening, this is an aside, but when I was listening to, when I first watched Reyner Banham Loves Los Angeles with this peculiar voiceover, and you hear the sound of his voice, and it's people who knew him say, oh yeah, I remember his strong Norwich accent, which is so characteristic of him, but his accent really doesn't, to me, sound like Norwich at all. I was thinking, oh, of course, he's from New Zealand. That's why he has this peculiar name that's actually made up of two surnames, as you know. Wrong and wrong, as it turns out.
Reyner Banham, known to his friends as Peter because that was his Christian name. Rather like, we also had in the options, we also had Buckminster Fuller. Reyner Banham I knew. Buckminster Fuller, I can remember thinking when I came across this curious and ingenious chap in my early undergraduate days, who on earth gives their child the first name Buckminster?
Buckminster. Actually, he's Richard, isn't he?
Yeah. The unhyphenated surname, obviously very fashionable at the time.
So yeah, Norwich.
An executive of, I think, the Vietnamese National Airways just said it was ranks amongst the best places in the world. I'm not sure if I share his rosy assessment, although it's got a very pretty cathedral.
It's a cathedral town. There's a rather, maybe we should drop
There's
it.
the University of East Anglia, which is got some pretty cool buildings.
Famously, it's the redoubt of Alan Partridge. Oh, I'm not sure what is his Norwichness meant to express about him, Partridge.
It's extremely provincial. It's not one of the more glamorous spots.
Yeah, so son of a gas fitter. Yeah, 1922.
I mean, the two facts we know about his childhood is he says he didn't particularly like school, but did all right, and liked going to a cheap cinema that was next door to it in a garage.
Yeah, and he seems to, as a child, to have always had like going into some form of engineering as the destination in mind. And he ended up going to Bristol when he was, 17 or 18?
Yeah, got an apprenticeship out of school.
He was both working and also studying at the same time or something in some kind of arrangement like that. Obviously, the Second World War has started up.
It would have been 1939, and there were openings in the aero manufacturing business at that time. So he got apprenticeship. Quite a few members of my mum's family went through almost exactly the same trajectory. Engineering apprenticeship, which means that you really do start like working lathes and stuff, building things, and then do sort of night school at the same time and go through various sort of steps and eventually hopefully qualify. It was the war though, so they were doing a lot of work. I think he found it rather difficult and he failed his exams at the end and seemed to have a sort of mini nervous breakdown and bummed around for a bit. So he didn't have to serve. Did a number of odd jobs for a bit. Got involved in amateur dramatics. What were the other things he was doing? Wrote a bit for a local magazine. And then in 1949, he comes down to London and gets a place at the Courtauld to study art history.
Courtauld Institute, which I think at that time was is it Portman Square? It's not in its current location in Somerset House at that point. Had been set up in the 1930s as part of the University of London. I guess it was probably one of the first places in England offering like a degree in art history as a distinct thing.
And was incredibly posh then and now.
Yeah, it is a sort of a place for posh girls to go and find someone to get married to, isn't it?
There's a little bit of that going on, yes. Although, I mean, it's always had a great academic reputation.
Yeah, and great like research output and
an almighty posh intake.
And a colourful cast of staff, including famously Sir Anthony Blunt, the Cambridge spy, who was there for a long time.
Yes, spy for the Soviets.
Spy for the Soviets,
One might say traitor, yes.
It was certainly a bit of light treachery. Yeah, it was the right sort of treachery. And the key character that he encounters there is Nikolaus Pevsner, who... I wonder what the timeline is here. So Pevsner had been like hanging around the Courtauld and doing funny bits of odd teaching, like teaching people Italian or whatever. But he'd been doing that since the early 30s. when he'd moved over.
I think the Courtauld would have been kind of rehydrating itself after. It's a bit of a funny thing to be running an art school, an art history establishment during a war.
There were funny things going on though. There was I think it was at the Courtauld that John Summerson was delivering his famous lectures on George and London.
Yeah,
like literally
While
as
it
it's
was
all
being
being
bombed.
as it's all being bombed. Yeah.
But who are the students? Like,
well, ladies, I suppose. Ladies and young men probably missing bits of their bodies. Yeah.
An atypical running.
Yeah. Well,
time,
Pevsner himself had been interned, so he'd been around for a bit in the 30s, and then he'd obviously come back, and at that point was a major, fairly established sort of figure. Pevsner is obviously an incredibly well-known historian of modern architecture, and known especially for his book Pioneers of Modern Design, which is this book which locates modern architecture. It sort of tells the story of like 18th and 19th century architecture in the way that it lays the ground for the invention of modern architecture.
Yeah, it's one of a few people at that time who were like, modernism has happened. How do we locate that in architecture history? Architecture history up until that time, or like immediately before then, was still super concerned with these are the styles of architecture that have been through history, and this is how they came into being, like Assyrian, Gothic, and then going through on that sort of Beaux-Arts canon. During the modernist period, there's a change both in the way people do cultural criticism to an extent, and you also have to accommodate something that explicitly doesn't want to be part of that history. And his take is it's part of the continuation of the sort of 19th century, like 19th century industrial technology, the 19th century kind of ethical architecture that we've been talking about, as in Puget Morris, which then kind of feeds through into the founders of the modern movement.
Got a funny quote from Pevsner about what the Courtauld was like. The Courtauld doesn't give much impression of a serious German-style approach. All girls, and they can present themselves for examination after 1 year. The courses are all far too short and not very thorough. In the words of a later critic, it doesn't say who, the Courtauld in his early days sometimes appeared to offer a little more than occupational therapy for the upper classes who wanted to get to grips with the iconography of their family portraits.
I mean, it's still a bit like that now. It must have been very peculiar. Like, Reyner Banham certainly identified as hard working class lefty. I don't know how rough his background, but one thing it definitely was completely different to the people at the Courtauld.
Yeah. I mean,
I think almost anyone going in there would develop like a chip on their shoulder.
So I think we should talk a little bit about what the German approach means. So what's the...
it's like coming out of literary criticism, isn't it? It's like sort of starts with like diehard biblical exegesis and goes through Masters of the Italian Renaissance or whatever it's called.
So there's a certain like scrupulousness about detail, isn't there?
Yeah. Fine, close analysis.
There is also, and this is something which comes into Pevsner's writing and also into Banham's, this interesting sort of locating the work of art vis-a-vis its age very much, isn't it?
Yes. Hegel was a very big figure at the end of the 19th century. Yeah, although by this point, like modernism has happened since then, as in modernism and criticism. I mean, what the German method, at its most superficial, it would mean the German university system, which was enormously more rigorous than the British one. And hence all of the serious big academic books at this time and before are in German.
It took him 2 attempts to got in the second time. And one of the things which he says is that when he started studying 20th century architecture as his focus at the Courtauld, he was basically the only person doing it. And that one of the things which he did was to make a kind of judicious selection of emphasis, which meant that the people there who were interested in that would favour him with lots and lots of time, and kind of he would generally like receive like a much higher level of nurturing than if he'd chosen the same sort of thing that everyone else had. Well, it's a kind of dynamic within like academic fields, isn't it? That you don't want to be the third most interesting person studying a particular thing. You want your own focus. And it seems kind of mad now, but really hardly anyone's writing about that stuff then.
He's not the first person to do it. Well, he's not the first person of his generation to do it, because obviously Siegfried Gideon and Pevsner had done it before. Gideon's approach is very different. It's really technological or at least in a sort of ideas, and really likes sort of constructivism. And
I think that there's this interesting sort of psychodramatic dimension to his relationship with Pevsner, which is that Pevsner gets really obsessed with Englishness.
Yeah,
in the post-war, around this period, he's already started the Buildings of England project, which kicked off in the late 40s.
Like T.S. Eliot or something. He's the sort of person who comes over and becomes more English than the English.
Yeah, he becomes obsessed with it, and he becomes obsessed with
suit.
And he has a kind of this sort of normative view that things in England should be a bit English. And in an architectural context, obviously, this aligns with a move in the immediate post-war towards a slightly softened, slightly romanticised, slightly picturesque version of modernism, which coincidentally we talked about in the last episode when we mentioned the Festival of Britain, for example.
Yeah, I think we almost sort of missed this enough, but I mean, it is like, as London is being blown up in the Blitz, the people who were previously kind of advocating knocking large chunks of it down and replacing it with white boxes were beginning to soften their attitudes, and also beginning to kind of get slightly rosy-eyed about streetscapes, and people are talking, soft modern. Well, so he's studying at this very posh place, and he obviously kind of stands out there on several levels amongst the intake as described, and he had always been very interested in technology and sort of the future rather than, and I think in a way the reason he goes into, or what's partly inspiring him to go into art history, is the idea that it can describe something more interesting. And I think he's also picking up from Pevsner. I mean, he's very Pevsnerian. But in his method and his style of analysis, he owes a lot to Pevsner, which is a good thing because Pevsner was a very smart man. Particularly, he obviously learns about how to do research, and his research is often exemplary. For the books in particular, like going through his life, like when he does articles and things, they can be very journalistic and kind of quick. But the research in the books is always good, even if sometimes the conclusions can be either good or bad.
So one thing that him and Pevsner both have in common is they both obviously had enormous image libraries.
As you had to at the time, no interwebs.
You can see that he's like taken the ethic basically, or the practice has been learnt. The doctoral thesis, and certainly the book that comes out of the doctoral thesis, is very much like staking out his own terrain, or it's a kind of critique of Pevsner's project and Pevsner's sort of formulation, isn't it?
Sort of. It's a critique of his conclusions, but not at all of his methods. It's still employing the kind of same iconographic approach to analysis, and
his is even richer actually, but like all of the semantics, all of the things which the different elements can mean, that they can connote, that they the way that those things are like expressive.
So it's still got that sort of analysis, but what it is a history of the architectural theory of the modern movement from its earliest beginnings.
Why, in a word, do we have to rewrite the history of the modern movement? Not because that history is wrong, simply because it is less than life-size. The official history of the modern movement, as laid out in the late 20s and codified in the 30s, is a view through the marrow hole of a dry bone. The view is only possible because the living matter of architecture, the myths and symbols, the personalities and pressure groups have been left out. The choice of a skeletal history of the movement, with all the futurists, romantics, expressionists, elementarists and pure aesthetes omitted, was the choice of the movement as a whole. Quite suddenly, modern architects decided to cut off half their grandparents without a farthing.
In a way, he's trying to repeat Pevsner's trick. Pevsner's trick is saying William Morris is really a modernist, which was very, like, on the face of it, very strange and radical. And he's going to say the modernist canon has edited out all of the bits that don't conform to the image. And he's got a particular focus on a sort of certain character type, as he likes, which is these eccentric radicals. A lot of them are old friends. Scherbart.
Paul Scherbart, F.T. Marinetti.
Marinetti, mad fascist. Bruno Taut, Saint Ilia, of the futurists. Bruno Taut of the Crystal Palace. The Crystal
The glass house, the glass paradise.
The more Germans, Polzig, expressionist, Mendelssohn, particularly his post-expressionist buildings, come in for a great expansion, even sort of managing to make barons kind of go in. So he's reappraising the work of a whole kind of tranche of people, also the works of people that they've kind of chosen to exclude once this canon of like Corbusian modernism was established. And in a way, we talked about this moment very early on when you have, the Workbund exhibition. Everyone after that, like before that, everyone's doing all sorts of things. After that, everyone's doing white boxes.
That's absolutely what he wants to critique. So if I could sum up his critique of what had happened in the history of modern architecture, it's that for various reasons, modern architecture is sort of an unfinished revolution. And it's one which, for whatever reason, prematurely formalizes, classicizes, creates and sort of solidifies an aesthetic which seems to sort of do the job of being new and of having maybe some kind of the qualities, some of sort of allegorical or metaphorical qualities of the machine, but which actually sort of turns away from and fails to embrace the logic of the machine age on its own, for itself, on its own terms.
Yes, that to some extent, although it's less explicit in the thesis project, where he really is uncovering all these people, and they have various things in common, which is that they are the bit which is not white boxes. They are interested in speed. Scheerbart is this guy who believes there's going to be giant vacuum cleaners everywhere exterminating insects. We can do away with roofs. Everything is going to be double-walled domes of glass, coloured glass, which is all going to rotate. Marinetti, incredibly fanciful and slightly manic thinker.
Yeah, he particularly loves the Futurist Architecture Manifesto, which is all the bits in it. It turns out later, after sort of research, are by Marinetti. They're all the bits about how none of the buildings are going to last longer than.
We're going to build everything and demolish everything and build everything and demolish everything. But the images are provided by Sant'Elia.
Yeah, there's this little phrase.
How do you pronounce his name?
Sant'Elia, I think.
Sant'Elia, yeah.
One of his little formulations, he talks about the book as a psychiatric inquiry into the springs of action, the grounds of inhibition. To the extent that it's responding to a particular contemporary condition or observation or something which he's irritated by, is by the sort of conservatism of post-war modernism. This way in which it sort of simultaneously seems to be doing modernism and to be doing it in the most unexciting way.
The book is mainly a historical thesis, and
that's
you have to read for things like that. You have to read between the lines, although not very hard.
I think the big idea is important because it shows that's obviously the direction which the research takes him in, or it's what becomes the first big polemic, but it's something which really animates so much of what he does afterwards as well.
I don't think it's actually quite formed until the end of the 50s, when a lot more. It's what the book will become very much. He adds a introduction and a conclusion and tweaks some bits.
Yeah, there's this nice moment he remembers. A critical intellectual breakthrough for him, or a kind of a dawning insight where he starts to understand what the futurists were all about, which happened to him while standing on the platform at Willesden Junction Station in northwest London, which is a sort of suburban junction station. It's a long way from anywhere. Yeah, so the design of the train is that is a sort of east-west railway, which is like a suburban railway, but there's also a mainline railway coming out of Euston, which goes underneath it.
And the main line has got this huge chugging steam train express that slams underneath and fills the room with noise and smoke. And above it, the little electric rinky-dink suburban bursts through this cloud of smoke. Yeah. And that's it. Speed, light, the machine.
Yeah, it's a kind of machinic orgasm, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's this euphoric moment where you're totally enveloped by the experience and the dynamism of the machine.
If you happen to see this trim little buggy zoom up and quickly swing into a tight parking spot, you'll be looking at a remarkable new car, the Davis three-wheeler. With four seated comfortably, it takes off. Streamlined as a plane is this unique creation, with designer Gary Davis at the wheel. Built in Southern California, it logically incorporates several aircraft principles, such as adaptation of the tricycle landing gear system. A switch on the dashboard operates built-in hydraulic jacks and makes tire changing an exhilarating
experience. So he loves that side and feels that that's the kind of technological promise. And I think the war is a very important... I was thinking this before. He comes from an incredibly unexciting technologically background. England in the 30s was
on a downward trend.
It wasn't quite as depressed as America in the Great Depression. Well, not in the South anyway. But it just wasn't that exciting. But we also had the war, which is this period where the nation is totally invested in the technology to win. And this technological arms race of radar, electronics, lights to spot bombers, gadgets and gizmos to navigate at night, submarine code breaking, just better engines, better planes, new tanks. And that comes up, and then the war kind of ends on this smash of the atomic bombings. Like, there's a whole new thing, and it's like this technological progress that was in the name of the common purpose of defeating the enemy has kind of reached this ecstatic, terrible climax. And that would have been him from like the age of 17 to like 25 or something. Formative days. And he's sort of looking for this super promise, as opposed to the kind of soft promises of the modernism of his day in England, this new empiricist kind of sellout stuff, as he would think of it, which is that we're going to have a more gentle urban... We're not quite going to knock everything down in the same way, although they were still knocking things down. They were
knocking lots of stuff down, but then they were like, the plan, basically. The plan was sort of modernist, but then they would sort of style it with, the stock brick and chimneys and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and some pointy roofs and some sort of slightly more gentle... the arrangement of blocks isn't going to be in grids and things.
I think the Festival of Britain in general got a bit of a bad rap. It had some pretty exciting stuff in it. The style of its presentation or something rubbed people up the wrong way. But actually, they had some pretty, the Dome of Discovery was a really exciting piece of engineering.
I don't think all their architecture was bad at all. A lot of it had to be put up very cheaply and shoddily. Lots of people's houses had been blown up, and they were pretty dreadful to begin with. And so the stuff that was being built did not live up to the promise of the atomic age. Yeah, I think he's searching for that excitement again.
Yeah, to some extent. So I think it's important that the point that he's making is that like white box, purified, simplified style, he's trying to drive a wedge between that and its machine age rhetoric. The way in which it's sort of described. And so he does like a famous analysis where he critiques Le Corbusier's famous spread with the Parthenon and the cars, where among other things he notes that the two cars which are shown are not standardized at all, but are like extremely customized, handmade. Corbusier has no intention of showing a Model T Ford or whatever.
Which is something he'll go back to again and again. It never goes away, this idea. Although, if you look at the Corbusier, it's not quite what he's saying, actually. Corbusier is saying that the form of the thing is kind of perfect and eternal. Car is like this optimal engineering thing. The Pantheon is not one of thousands either.
The totality has been read by two generations of architects and theorists as meaning that a standardized product like motor car can be as beautiful as a Greek temple. In its context, that is how it must be read. But the tertium comparationis of the argument...
He loves untranslated phrases in Latin, German, Italian, and French, scattering them throughout his work as a sign of how frightfully clever he is.
I think that's probably a Courtauld habit, isn't it? Of the argument is a disingenuous practice. None of the motor cars illustrated is a standardised, mass-produced model. All are expensive, specialised, handicraft one-offs, which can justly be compared to the Parthenon because, like it, they are unique works of handmade art. Mass-produced vehicles like the Model T Ford are not allowed to sully these classicist pages. Basically, he's trying to make the case that there can be... modern architect can be all about technology and not look like the kind of international style.
That, in fact, expressionism or futurism or the glass house, the glass crystal paradise are more in keeping with the technological order than the art object white boxes. of Corbusier and Mies.
I'm not sure that he's totally against Le Corbusier, because at least Le
He's
Corbusier
well up for it.
because at least Corbusier is sort of formulating his own response to the machine age. And I think, as are all of those other people that we mentioned, they're all making a kind of... They're all making a kind of... they're making their own commitment, and they're making their own way to try to articulate an architecture which is on the terms of the machine in whatever... But what he's against is the formalism. The idea, really, that Corbusier sort of... his architecture at one remove, as it were, becoming a style, is the thing which he's against.
Or against the notion that this is how it should always be, which he attacks by introducing relatively unknown people, like Scheerbardt. And it then becomes more polemic later. The book itself is actually kind of structured... Initially, there's a kind of brief history, and then it goes through by country and movement. And it doesn't have this... Like most of his books, it doesn't actually... The sort of thesis doesn't really appear through most of the books. There's often an interesting snappy bit in the conclusion.
No, most of it's research.
His take on what he's read of this succession of movements.
It's not that he thinks that, you know, quote unquote expressionist architecture or something is any more appropriate than the international style. Actually, he attacks people like Bruno Zevi, who are attempting a kind of project of expressionist continuation in the post-war. You know, he has pretty stern words for what he sees as these Italian architects who are who have a sort of moment in the early 50s when they're very much in fashion, who are like returning to those sorts of sources as well, or returning to Art Nouveau. He quotes that funny Marinetti quote about Ruskin, where it's talking about it being like a grown man who wants to go back and suckle his milkmaid again.
Yeah, so that he can feel like a child. You mean wet nurse, not milkmaid.
The purpose of expanding the canon, like back then, is like to break the stranglehold of a particular like norm. It's not to say that those ones actually are a better source. Actually, none of them are a good source.
No, nothing's a good source. You've got to, this is something he's always... You've got to find the future. His entire life is a constant search for what is the right and relevant and authentic architecture of the time and the future. I mean, that's sort of what his thesis is, in tandem with him having a job as the literary editor of the Architectural Review, which is a fantastic job for him, and which he is highly productive in producing articles, and it also gives him an opportunity to meet everyone and talk to everyone, and kind of really lays the groundwork for his life of sort of analysis, because he can talk to and research all of the people who are still alive. He interviews Mies van der Rohe many times, like basically every modernist.
Oh, I thought Mies was the only one he didn't interview.
Oh no, yeah, because it's Gropius he does. He has a series of questions about Mies's car, and he asks kind of all of these. He asks Siegfried Gideon, he asks Gropius about this question, and he never gets the answer. I got it wrong. It's Gropius. It is Gropius's car. Why has it got a hinge on both sides and a door handle on both sides? Well, the mystery was never solved. And he's also taking opinions in articles on what's going on in the day. And suffice to say, he takes quite strong opinions.
Yeah, pretty much from the beginning. So he's one of the things which is interesting about and kind of rewarding about reading bits of his journalism is that you get a very strong sense of the enthusiasms and fashions of the day in quite a sort of granular year by year level. Yeah. So in the early 50s, there was this Italian thing. Everyone was into Italy. Everyone was into neo-liberty. Everyone was into, Nervi and these other glamorous Italian architect engineers and Vespas and espresso bars. One of the most remarkable developments of the 1950s was the craze for Italian design, which galvanized the smarter elements of all classes of British society. The scooter, the Olivetti typewriter, furniture by Gio Ponti, hairstyling by Richard Henry, espresso coffee and its attendant machinery, certain tricks of shape, design and display, and even certain typefaces from the Nebbiolo foundry helped to stamp the image of Italy as the home of good design at all levels of consumption. The reasons for this development have baffled critics and sociologists from the time of its first appearance in 1953 to its waning around 1960. The The Triennale was a major contributing influence at the level of conscious design. The cinema and motor racing also played their part, but explanations based simply on good taste and engineering cannot explain the whole Italian mania. Espresso machines, as several critics pointed out, usually had a strong flavour of Detroit or Paris 1925. There's little doubt that the rise of teenage affluence and the improved quality of inexpensive, fashionable clothes also had a large part in the phenomenon.
Combining the leisurely graces of 17th century England with the colour, art and imagination of modern taste, coffee houses like this one at Kensington are having a new vogue throughout the country. Waiters from Trinidad and Marseille, furnishings from Argentina and Hong Kong, music from Latin America. These exotic touches create an unusual and colourful atmosphere.
And then that sort of went out of fashion again 3 or 4 years later.
They're still sort of into he's super against new empiricism and conservation. He's like, we should just knock down everything.
That was in the late 40s. So new empiricism is sort of vaguely Swedish-inspired modern architecture, which we've already gone through a few times. Yeah, one of the things he's against early on is conservation, but although actually it's a bit more complicated than that. Because he then quite quickly starts writing these laments for Victorian buildings which have been knocked down, because it takes a lot longer. People very early on get into Georgian stuff. They got into it during the war really, and like people being pro Georgian conservation happens pretty early on, and he's rather against that. I think partly that's a sort of anti-bourgeois sort of pose he takes. But like the demolition of the coal exchange in London, for example, is something which he...
Like the language he uses to be pro-demolition is extraordinarily strong.
Yeah, very glib, yeah.
Like later on when he's like, it's a disaster they've saved Covent Garden. The French really know how to do things. They would have knocked it all down. They knocked down Azal. That's the best thing ever. We need to knock down much more. Why isn't there a motorway going straight through the middle of London?
Yeah, but then also he has these lines where he sort of says it doesn't matter if you knock down the buildings as long as you maintain the urban grain, or you maintain the urban texture.
Which is some sort of sense that he says what's probably gives the character of the street is the sort of its links of communication.
Yeah, or scale or
infrastructure. Yeah.
You can't really maintain that if you knock everything down in one go, though. That tends to go.
And put a 8-lane motorway through the middle.
Should we go into the sort of company that he falls into at this point as well? During the 6 years of his so 1952 to 58, he's writing the thesis.
Well, I mean, it's good to mention that he's writing loads of interesting articles on basically everything that's being built. That little book you've got of his history of, well, not his history, it's just like sampler of modern architecture, which is mainly articles written for the Architectural Review at that time.
Yeah, well, actually, it's got relatively little. It's got only about 10 things from the 50s, which I think is the most interesting period, because he doesn't really have any other outlet at that point.
It's really great, just in its own terms. It's not something we can really go into, but it's a great sampler of just interesting analysis, funny, intelligent breakdowns of loads of buildings. And that's something I think that I really get. I like he's just really good at that sort of architectural journalism of covering the day-to-day of what's going on.
Yeah, there's a nice one. There's a nice one he writes about airliners around that time, which is talking about how lovely the old McDonnell Douglas DC-6 or something is, compared with the new airliners, which are more modern and they're jet engines rather than propeller ones, but they're just horrible on the inside or whatever. It's
cute. Yeah, and he can have opinions all over the place on all sorts of things, on that sort of stuff. He's never someone who minds writing two completely contradictory things in different places. That's totally fine. In the early 50s, there's a meeting organised by a splinter group from the ICA, Institute of Contemporary Arts.
Yeah, they were a group of young, somewhat disaffected intellectuals hosted by the ICA, although one of the few things which seems to have brought them all together is how much they disliked the director of the ICA, Herbert Reed.
I mean, they were brought together by the ICA because they were all there already.
He continued to support them as well.
They didn't all hate. This is the era of the angry young men.
So this is the independent group, and they're, among them, the artist Edoardo Paolozzi, the architects Alison and Peter Smithson.
Great and rather difficult characters.
Yeah, force of nature. Richard Hamilton, the artist, yeah. And then also Nigel Henderson, as a photographer, also features. It's kind of a salon, isn't it? they're doing all of this stuff?
It's very occasional, and it sort of changes. I mean, the first one is Paolozzi has got this huge chest full of like American magazines that he's had like shipped over and sort of collections of things, which he's been using to make his collages through the 40s.
Yeah, proto-pop art.
You know, guy in a bikini, or like guy in a budgie smugglers, something, bang, car, There's fantastic images of American food, jelly salad, all these sort of strange fluorescent objects floating around in a soup.
Yeah. Paolozzi, he's sort of obsessed with like pop culture and also technology, and quite an amazing body type, like as wide as he is tall. Yeah, he was still knocking around in Edinburgh when I was a child.
For me, by far my favourite of his work is the sort of primitivist stuff, strange, enigmatic, boxy things made of bronze. He does a lot of public sculpture, which I think is often bad.
Yeah, he becomes in the later version, he becomes a sort of self-referential like kitsch of himself. But the early stuff, there's a strong So one of the things which is knocking around is in kind of art historical conceptual terms is this idea of art brut or art brut or like however, which is the idea of people reacting against the sort of Constantin Brancush, Henry Moore modernist art as something which is elegant, universal, kind of a form above everything else, kind of defined by a sort of like eternal quality.
Although they do almost exactly the same thing, but with a different sort of emphasis. They reach for eternity not on the basis of the sort of perfect form, but on the basis of like we're going to look at the art out of mental asylums and try, and we're going to find in it some rough, eternal thing from the human spirit.
But in visual terms, that means that instead of these like beautiful, smooth, undulating, like marble or bronze or whatever forms, you have these things which are messily hacked out of clay and then cast in bronze and have this like raised, rough-hewn, sort of slightly nightmarish, slightly beautiful quality.
Yeah, not necessarily that nightmarish. I mean, they're not. Look them up. It's good stuff. Anyway.
But so he falls in with all that lot, Banham, and starts attending the lectures, and then starts helping to organise them. I think he was sort of relatively underemployed, as PhD students often are.
He organised a few of them, yeah. And there aren't that many people at them. No. And they're not doing that much. What they do is they get all sorts of strange experts in to present the stuff that they've been doing. So like someone's written a book on cybernetics.
That's it. Their fascinations, first of all, they're like in pursuit of any kind of interesting image, aren't they? So it's like, oh wow, here's like these X-ray microscope images, or here are these like bizarre things from the fringes of American pop culture. Here are these photos taken on this anthropological expedition of this kind of like strange indigenous architecture.
Let's collage them with bits of our artwork and stick up a wall.
What that represents is it's like super anti-academic or like super anti-academist. Yeah. It's like we're sort of smashing what I think they perceived as a sort of reclassicizing of what kind of like beauty or artistic virtue was in the continuity modernism of the period.
Sure, and also a strong interest in the exotic and distant American popular culture, which was basically exclusively available in the form of films and magazines.
Yeah, the cars start appearing, in like the 50s or something? Banham like recalls the first time he saw an American car in the flesh.
But like they see a lot of magazines and not very many cars, not many actual objects. Like the white heat of America is cooling across a shrinking sea, but it's still a pretty big sea in the early 50s.
And this is also, this is definitely the period of, which maybe never ended, but like Britain in the post-war instantly like falls behind the rest of Europe as well as America, doesn't it?
By the time the kind of Marshall Plan funding starts to come in, which is around the beginning of the Korean War and the sort of change in global political priorities, is ready to go, and the post-war economic boom starts. But there's quite a bit of period of extreme shittiness, grueling and grim, revolting food.
So the independent group, you tend to like encounter them in the if you're doing the story of 20th century architecture, basically always encounter them, in spite of them being like a fairly like relatively marginal bunch of people at the time. I think that there are two reasons for that. One is that the Smithsons, although their built output is relatively small, I think were at times quite prescient and at times quite sort of influential in codifying, or coming up with the kind of soundbite for a particular idea that would go on to become more widespread and influential. Kind of vector which becomes Team 10, the overthrow of the like Siam old guard by the new architects, and all of the various movements which come out of that, whether that's like structuralism, these kind of organic, all these like super interesting buildings of the like mid and late 60s. If you're tracing it back, that sort of seems to be where things are germinating, is like in the ICA in the early 50s. I think that's certainly why it has its position in the big story. Main output which they had is that they did a few exhibitions. They did an early one called Parallel of Life and Art, which is an exhibition Banham wasn't involved in, and it's an exhibition of lots of pictures.
Yeah, of like scientific images and art images, kind of put
kind of everything together. Yeah, and that's sort of interesting. And I think it's good. It kind of tells you a lot about what they thought about images and what they were interested in.
Yeah, and also the relationship with image is like the most important thing there, really.
And then they did another one called This Is Tomorrow, which had it was sort of based around environments, and they're these sort of...
Back when, like, the biggest call was a cardboard cutout of the robot from Forbidden Planet.
Yeah, these sort of environments which are sort of somewhat like... Some of them are about perception, some of them are like somewhat symbolic.
There's a film of it. It looks very budget and, like, sub-art school. Like, there's a lot of, like, real, like, dodgy bits of, like, papier-mâché sort of string spinning on bits of string.
I think we'll probably come back to that, because actually the real thing of significance that happens in the same year as that is another exhibition that the Smithsons were in, where they did their Home for the Future. But we'll come back to that. Banham sort of attaches himself to and becomes interested in particular the architecture which Alison and Peter Smithson are talking about and starting to practice.
Oh, I thought going along with that, he's also like writing loads about pop stuff, and he's getting really excited by these American cars and their wacky shapes, and sort of writes about them as if they were like using one of his tricks is kind of using the Courtauld style of kind of iconic analysis that would be traditionally applied to, like, a Caravaggio painting to Buick.
Yeah, and talking about its industrial design, on as if he was like a fine art painter or whatever.
Yeah, or even like the feeling of a crisp packet or something. And it does a load of ones like that, which I think raise his profile and people find very fun. Yeah, he has a tight group of friends, and the first ones we're going to meet in the architectural sense are Alison and Peter Smithson.
We should just signal that there's this thing called Brutalism. The new Brutalism, which they, I think, coin.
At first, I think, are accused of being by other people and then adopt.
They adopt, and
lots of things were being called the new something at the time.
So, and you had the new empiricism knocking around, so it's this slightly antagonistic like label to attach yourself to show that you're not that. Like, it attaches to two projects in particular, which are early ones. And what's interesting, people obviously have an idea of what Brutalism is now, and I think that's fine. But it obviously meant something quite different at the time that it was being formulated.
Well, certainly to him. And to an extent, possibly to the Smithsons in that moment. Yeah, what we can say is that the movement that he describes and is talking about is not really what we call Brutalism now. And you've got to know that first. And in fact, that's true of various architectural movements he describes. He kind of describes the bit of it that he's interested in, which is not necessarily what history would eventually, after all the dust had settled, would see.
It's a lot more art brut than it is beton brut. Later on, people become fixated on the connection to concrete.
I actually think, though, it was always attached to concrete, and I think he decides that he wants to exclude that.
Yeah, but the projects which they described as brutalist and which are like the early ones don't have any concrete, and actually people hadn't. The glory days of concrete are ahead, because I think that really wasn't really enough money to start doing that kind of stuff yet. They were building with like bricks.
There was a lot of concrete flying around by the... Yeah, there was concrete was beginning to fly around.
You can't really do prestige concrete though.
No.
It's not an option yet. There are two projects. One's a non-realised housing project, like a single house, I think in Soho, and one is the Hunstanton School, which is this famous design of a school, which is a sort of somewhat Miesian-looking steel-framed box with big areas of glazing and brick infill. And it's got a big water tower, which you can see, which is the most prominent element. What makes it brutalist is a quality of truth to materials, like the materials being what they are, or a certain like...
There's a famous bit in it, which is in the bathroom, the sinks have got a pipe going down where the wastewater goes down, and it just meets a gully, and the water just comes out and hits a gully in the floor, which is meant to be this extremely freighted, like, this is honesty. Honesty is you see all of the water running out of the bottom of the sink. I mean, the building itself is kind of formal. It's like a double courtyard of, black painted, steel glazed boxes with brick panel infill and a sort of outbuilding.
At least rhetorically, though, it is that, isn't it? It's about, I think somewhere he says, like, this is a building where nothing is anything other than exactly what it appears to be, which everywhere reject kind of propriety or doing anything for the sake of appearances, and which sort of wields its own like industrial materiality with the intention of sort of slightly shocking kind of bourgeois morality.
Yeah, and he's very excited by this and thinks that it might be the future. He's all the way through searching for what the future's going to be. What is now true to our industrial economy? It's this thing of taking stuff clunkily, throwing together, like not being interested in detailing, or at least like making a big show of demonstrative details suggesting clunkiness. He formulates that into a famous essay. I mean, the first chunk of it just goes through what he regards as the etymology of the term, and then it analyses this project and suggests what New Brutalism should be. And he's got a triad, which I can't remember.
1, formal legibility of plan. 2, clear exhibition of structure. And 3, valuation of materials for their inherent qualities as found. This is very characteristic. He starts talking about Thomas Aquinas. Where Thomas Aquinas supposed beauty to be quod visum placet, that which seen pleases, image may be defined as quod visum perturbat, that which seen affects the emotions, a situation which could subsume the pleasure caused by beauty, but is not normally taken to do so. For the new brutalists' interest in image are commonly regarded by many of themselves, as well as of their critics, as being anti-art, or at least by any rate anti-beauty in the classical aesthetic sense of the word. What pleased St. Thomas was an abstract quality, beauty. What moves a new brutalist is the thing itself in its totality, with all its overtones of human association.
So it's sort of proposing a new industrial sublime of like things clunkily put together, and which is very readable. Like, one thing, he loves it when it's readable. Like, you've got to be able to tell from the plan what is what. You've got to be able to tell each piece of, like, you see something, it's doing what it looks like it's doing. A steel thing is going up. It does what it looks like it's doing. What do you think it is? Yeah,
it does what it looks like it's doing. And it's kind of shocking for being so much itself. You always have to have in the back of your mind, like, who's this meant to displease? Maybe like public school educated, social democratic leaning sort of city administrator or something, who like despises popular culture and is going to be...
But I mean, Hunstanton School is the opposite of popular culture.
That's sort of the tension in...
And in fact, the Smithsons, with one exception, are high culture architects. What we've described is essentially what he would describe as the totality of brutalism. Those two projects and maybe like 2 others. So it can be quite confusing hearing this term brutalism, which is super fashionable now and had a huge meaning in the 60s, being described to a couple of projects which don't really feel brutalists. He then finds another project that he thinks Sheffield University extension, which is a little bit after he wrote that essay, which he feels it's a much bigger project, but it's got this thing where it's kind of long slab block, which kind of moves around in a curve around some sort of circulation, and there's other and the demonstrative nature of the circulation and concrete structure. It's much more kind of classically brutalist. Building might be brutalist, but he kind of sort of suggests that nothing else is.
It's the shock of the new, or it's the shock of the way things really are.
It's definitely not the shock of the new. It's not high tech, I don't think, brutalism. Like, super honesty.
It's uncompromising.
What you see is what you get. It's like sort of chip on your shoulder, like everything is just going to be how it is. This is an idea that doesn't sustain itself for very long.
No. It sustains itself for about 2 years, and then he's past it. He's on to the next thing.
And actually, brutalism goes off and becomes a big thing, and it becomes this idea of kind of geometrically exciting exposed concrete, big buildings.
Yeah, there's sort of still an interest in these effects, which are a little bit kind of art brut, aren't they? They are the pleasure of like roughness, and also like an expression of circulation is important in brutalist buildings. Like the way you show staircases and walkways and decks and things is, and sculptural concrete, funny shapes. Love the stuff, you know. But that's kind of his first sort of proposal of what the new architecture is going to be. It's going to be this radical honesty. And it runs out of steam almost immediately. So like by 1956, the Smithsons do a thing for This Is Tomorrow, which he has some kind of obscure objection to, which I think is that it has some sort of symbolic allusions to the hearth, and he thinks, oh, that's a bit reactionary for me, and he starts to go off it. Well, there's something which I think is interesting, which you really get from this, which is how small the scene was at the time.
Oh yeah,
and in a way
they could all go to one dinner party,
and in a way, like he's a consummate sort of scenester. He makes the scene small. He knows everyone through his whole life.
He's got a salary, so he buys artworks of the artists. He writes in the Architectural Review things justifying the works of the architects, and he's got access to everyone, so he can talk to everyone. And he's a social organizer, so he knows everyone, and he's useful, and can make and wants to be useful.
But throughout his life, also, he's still able, into the 70s, to sort of articulate what's going on in modern architecture at a particular time. He's able to weave like a big narrative.
He's able to weave a big narrative, but it isn't like it's not a global narrative. And it is a selective one, but he's very good at it. Yes, he's very good at codifying things.
I guess you can locate it probably in that Smithson's project. So they did this thing for the Ideal Home Show.
It's in a big conference centre, and it sort of sells lots of products for people to buy.
Sponsored by the Daily Mail, which tells you something about its intended demographic.
If you've got like a high-tech mop or something, and in the middle, they normally get someone to design an ideal house. They still do it to this day. Patrick Lynch did one.
It was sort of a leaning solid timber structure or something, wasn't it? Not very cosy.
Anyway, lots of people have done them. It's not like a smash hit list of names. This is not. And Alison and Peter Smithson got the thing to do one, and they made a sort of plastic pod box, all groovy, swervy shapes on the inside with a big chrome. You know those things that would be like halfway up the outside of a car in the 50s, like a chrome sort of bar,
like a gunnel on a boat. I don't know what it's called on a car.
And like the TV is like built into the wall, and all the sort of products are built into the wall, and everything's kind of groovy and swoopy, and it's like a pod.
It's an appliance house, isn't it? Everything, like all the mod cons are all like contained by it.
It's like a sort of souped up version of the house from Mon Oncle.
But it's more like the inside of a car or something. Like it's kind of made to look as if it's injection molded, all non-orthogonal spaces, a continuous surface, which is the floor, which becomes the bed platform, all that kind of
yeah. And the toaster's sort of
part of the bookshelf, or like.
What I imagine it to have is a thing where there's a slot in the wall into which you put your bread and the toast.
Yeah, and the toast comes back. Yeah, that's the dream, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean, it's in the 50s still, right? Or is it the beginning of the 60s?
That's in 56.
56, yeah. And it's kind of like more plastic, fantastic version of sort of Eames furniture. I think it would be called Atomic Age. I don't know what colour it was, but I imagine the whole thing being shocking pink.
Yeah, I don't know either. It's all photographed in black and white. But Banham's next big idea really is about circling back to the interest in pop and in the way in which pop culture is like exists in such profusion and is constantly like renewing itself. And he becomes interested in the idea that maybe the zeitgeist is all about expendability. Like the culture of our era is defined by being evanescent, by having absolutely no shelf life, being over before it's even started. There's a Roland Barthes quote about plastic where he says that the nature of plastic is that it is the first material which is entirely consumed in the act of being used, or like that's sort of the appearance that it gives, that it's the first thing which like a single purpose and then like disappears. Or
perhaps I got a different reading of this. I think it means like expendability of style, like, you know, GM is like throwing out all of these cars and they're all essentially the same car with different bodywork. First half of 1956 it's going to have this sort of fin, and then we're going to put a grill on it the next half of 1956. Everything is going to be like continually kind of updated in a way to gin up sales. And eventually they're going to come up with a fantastic idea of making everything to break really quickly. You know, you've got to have your iPhone's got to have a battery in it that gets knackered after 18 months. So you get another one.
Yeah.
All similar. And he thinks this is fantastic. Or at least at one point he sort of proposes it as the thing that's going to kind of transform culture.
In order to sort of seize hold of the zeitgeist, that's what culture of all sorts has to take on or become. Yeah. Well, I think literally a lot of it is about the idea of having no shelf life at all. So in architecture, he becomes really interested in the idea of an architecture where you can literally swap the bits out. There's this idea of clip-on architecture, which never really exists as anything except for as more than a paper idea, does it?
So, I mean, we should go through it properly, but I think there are things that come out of it, but he's not interested in them, he doesn't write about them. So, like, Grimshaw's, like, tower that plugs into, you know, the tower of, like, toilet cubicles, there's, like, a helix, that's, like, you're plugging it into a building.
But you never unplug them and put a different one on.
No, you never have the thing.
That is never fulfilled.
It's never fulfilled, no. The initial idea, as I understand it, of plug-in architecture is that you can have a box on wheels that you can, or something that you can plug into an old building to activate it with services. And that sort of does have some things. Yeah, I mean, only like, yes, an oil rig. But why would you want to? Lots of people try the idea. It's like megastructure. It's never extended. He sort of has that idea, or is like playing with this idea of like that the service might get plugged into things. And various people in the 50s are playing with this idea of advancing prefabrication. I guess serious prefabrication had happened in the 20s, is that right? For like the beginning of like volume house building, you'd like prefabricate walls and stuff, and people are beginning to get to the idea of like doing bathroom pods on a kind of commercial basis. And then he's sort of exploring these ideas that people are like, various people have been trying, you'll prefabricate an entire room and plonk it down on a site, and you'll have sort of gasket or zip up connections between various things and kind of plug things together, which are all kind of on the fringes in the 50s. Then Archigram comes along at the beginning of the 60s, but are we going to talk about that now?
I guess we could do, yeah. Well, we could talk about borax.
Borax is a washing salt product. It's a chemical. But it also is a word used to describe the sort of disposable, streamlined style, usually as a negative by most people. And it means kind of those things that were kind of cutting edge in 30s, you know, deco, streamlined, swoopy curves, but when applied to consumables of the 50s and 60s. And he sees that as a great popular style. He's got this thing, he's got a sort of class argument, which is that this stuff is popular. I know people think it's commercial schlock, but it must have a real core to it because people are drawn to it, and that's what matters. Which he also says about pop music and stuff. He says like manufactured pop music's fine because if it wasn't a real cultural expression of the people, they wouldn't be drawn to it.
Yeah, there's this famous essay called "The Machine Aesthetic," which is sort of a defense of car design and like the borax of car design with its like flashiness and its sort of curviness and all of this. And he makes the point in that we shouldn't try to judge that sort of design by architectural standards. That like a building is a serious long-term investment which has got to last a long time, whereas a car is something on a much faster cycle. But what he's going to start to get into is the idea that you might have buildings which are like cars.
You can probably remember when superficial features used to be added to the basic shape of a car in an attempt to suggest a feeling of movement, such as this radiator ornament, for instance. Now, in the 1955 Ford, the feeling of motion has been built right into the basic shape of the car itself. Let me show you specifically what I mean. Notice how the line of the car flows from front to rear in an almost imperceptible curve, and how the front fenders, the reach of the visored headlights, and the drawn-out taillights extend this smooth, unbroken line. The lowered hood and the sweep of the all-round windshield blend into this line perfectly, adding to the lively feeling of motion in the overall appearance of this car. Now, when the design of a car expresses its function forcefully and imaginatively, of course we derive more pleasure from owning and using it.
The imaginative styling of the 1955 Ford is also evident in Ford's exciting new use of chrome and stainless steel trim, in Ford's fresh new colors and smart modern interiors. You're invited to come in and see the beautiful new 1955 Fords now at your Ford dealers.
It starts off that he just likes cars. He thinks they're cool. He wants to make a defense of them.
He writes loads of articles about particular cars, like there's one, cars that are comparing the styles and reviewing cars.
This is very Partridge of him, actually, isn't it?
The beginning of Vehicles of Desire. Can I read the first bit of that? Because that really is a silly, funny quote. The new brutalist pacemakers and phrasemakers of the anti-academic lineup, having delivered a smart KO to the Land Rover some months back, have followed up with an eye-popping OK for the Cadillac convertible. Automobile aesthetics are back on the table for the first time since the 20s. The next time an open caddy wombles by you, it's chrome hung like a pearl-roped dowager in its long top level with the ground at a steady 30 inches, save where the two tail fins cock up to carry the rear lights. Reflect what a change has been wrought since the last time any architect expressed himself forcibly on the subject of the automobile. Carries on in similar tones. They're all like that, but he's great fun to read. I mean, the tone is bonkers often in the articles.
I think it's more like the cars and consumer culture in general start off just being an object of fascination and desire and then come to represent something. And what they represent is something sort of like freedom, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, okay, so you're in bombed out Norwich or even crappy London. There's rationing. Food is terrible. He's talking about the fashion for espresso. There was basically nowhere in London you could get a coffee.
There were 2 places in the West End.
The food culture at the time was appalling. So he's got that world, and then he's going into the Courtauld, as a student. There's a class element, and it just looks so much cooler there. That magazine world just looks so much cooler than here. And it's also the stuff that I'm into with my working class identification. He says that people thought of us appreciating, us meaning his group of friends, appreciating popular culture, that we were high culture people dabbling in a kind of low culture world. But really, he thought of himself as which in the case of the independent group is not quite right, because some of them were pretty posh, and certainly not the Smithsons were not.
No, they were merely provincial
upper middle class.
Which is a dangerous class, because they know how the system works, but they're disaffected. Yeah.
And also, the stuff can be quite fun. And he wasn't in America, so he doesn't actually have to eat the frog eye salad. But at that distance, it can just seem just so good,
So, yeah, I think for me, it's just important that I don't think you can quite understand his particular view of the sort of clip-on utopia and what that's going to develop into without understanding how much consumer society represented sort of freedom and pleasure to him.
Consumerism and like that is a pretty much untrammeled good for him at this period, and really that's his instinct all the way through. That like I think he sees the idea that in America there must be this thing where everyone gets what they want. It's kind of like the Kafka book.
Sure, and I guess, but partly it's because it really was an era of like affluence was starting to come.
Certainly compared to here, like the effects. I'm not an expert again, but the effects of America of the Second World War. America didn't have austerity. America wasn't bombed out. America came out of the war with a booming economy, without millions of refugees and burnt out homes. Yeah, the economic prospects were just of a different order.
So he increasingly starts to see technology taking leave of architecture and starting to define a way of creating like space and environment and habitation, which is actually like beyond architecture or like beyond the end of architecture.
The start of the book, rather than the thesis of Theory and Design, has got that fantastic, like, this is technology. Technology is the thing. Like, everyone's going to be released on it. And the conclusion has a statement that how is the architect going to work with technology? They're going to have to run to keep up. And are they going to, like, is their culture going to kind of, like, disappear in that running? Or are they going to be able to keep up with technology? And then a few years later, he does a series of essays, some by him, all curated by him, called Stock Taking. Starts with a famous divided essay, which kind of has tradition on one side and technology on the other.
Yeah, and it's this sort of formal experiment in text, because they both start with architecture, as ... Architecture goes straight into like a recent discussion of the ways in which people have started to look back to the past and the ways in which they've started to try and kind of critically reformulate modern style. And technology is all straight into like draining disease-ridden swamps and that kind of thing, an altogether more heroic enterprise.
There's a number of other essays in the series, but in there he's essentially, there are obviously like the engineers, like Corb's engineers, you know, these like virile men who are untroubled by the terrible culture of architecture, and architects on the other side who are sort of image makers and have what he calls a tradition. He doesn't mean a tradition like their traditional architects, like their Quinlan and Terry. He means a tradition as in there is an accepted canon of culture, of modernism, of everything that is taught, you know.
Yeah, there's a good quote. So here's a bit just right from the end of the science half. He said, the technology half, he says, on both sides, enterprising and intensive scrutiny of tradition and science appears to suggest a way out of a dilemma, if not a solution to a problem. But it is a balancing feat that may prove to need acrobatic skill and expertise in brinkmanship, as architects edge temerariously along the margin of scientific disciplines and never quite put a foot over into the other camp. From the scientific side, there is neither such caution nor such finesse. It appears always possible that at any unpredictable moment, the unorganised hordes of uncoordinated specialists could flood over into the architect's preserves and, ignorant of the law of operation, create an other architecture by chance, as it were, out of apparent intelligence and the task of creating fit environments for human activities. And it's that sort of expressed with like a little bit of sort of concern trolling there, but like really that's what he's proposing actually might be.
Yeah, which is presumably like these wonderful municipal hospital buildings that seem to be like devoid of... Yeah, the sad reality of what happens when you just let a building be designed by like specialists is that it is absolute crap. Like they become appalling and totally unfit for purpose, unsurprisingly. They're radical proposals, but he's sort of proposing different ones that are kind of in tandem with each other. There's another essay in there called Science for Kicks, in which he sort of says that like that the engineers can like have a kind of amateur interest in architecture, but the architects must really have a like joke interest in science or a playful interest in science.
Mm-hmm.
And that play of science or like the sort of demonstration or jokey ideas or image making of science is one path that architecture could take. I can't work out if he's sort of suggesting that architects just have this like playful interest in science, like, you know, with the independent group we had the scientific image and the painting next to each other? Or is it like the building should kind of look like a science experiment, like, which is kind of like, feels like archigram or something like that, some image potential? Or is it just that architects should be interested in those technologies in a fun way and want to play around with air ducts or something, or want to play around with difficult? Anyway,
for me, the most interesting part of the essay is that this little thing at the end where it says the gap, urban design, which is in between the two. And I think that there is something perceptive. And he talks, basically, he says, our urban design is complete crap and like it's not working at all. And we've got a lot further to go with it, which I think is perceptive. And there is something I find myself thinking is a bit bizarre about the architectural discourse of that period. Like, there are such profound changes going on at the scale of like whole cities, enormous neighborhoods being knocked down, all of these kind of things. And mysteriously, all anyone wants to talk about is the treatment of like the drain pipes on Stirling and Gowan's Ham Common housing scheme. And it seems peculiar, actually, don't you think? And I think that is perceptive. Actually, there is something really odd about the way in which the discourse is working at that point.
So this interest in kind of technology leads him eventually to try and get to the source of America. He's had this interest, and he manages to get a scholarship, traveling fund. Is it the Graham Foundation? And they pay for him to like go backwards and forwards to America for like 5 years. In 1964, research for a book that would become The Architecture of the Well-Tempered Environment.
When you step inside the total electric home, you step into an entirely new concept in living, organized around electric centers, such as this entertainment center. Electric heating and cooling keep the home constantly and automatically at the most livable temperatures all year round, and keep it clean and healthful too. Sterile lamps kill airborne bacteria, while electrostatic filters remove pollen and dust.
But early on in that, he begins to propose other architecture, which is much more radical take on where this gap between technology and architecture goes, which is an architecture where there isn't any architecture, there's just technology. It's that technical path taken to its extreme in an essay called A House Is Not a Home, with super groovy graphics.
When your house contains such a complex of piping, flues, ducts, wires, lights, inlets, outlets, ovens, sinks, refuse disposers, hi-fi reverberators, antennae, conduits, freezers, heaters, when it contains so many services that the hardware could stand up by itself without any assistance from the house, why have a house to hold it up? When the cost of all this tackle is half the total outlay, or more as it often is, what is the house doing except concealing your mechanical pudenda from the stares of the folks on the sidewalk?
So, I mean, this is kind of a radical proposal, and it's got these super cool drawings in it, which are by
François Delegre. It's a very successful collaboration with an illustrator, essentially. Yeah.
Like, two of them are super famous. We can talk about the others. The first, I think, really cool one is it's a bubble sort of perched on the top of Mount Ararat, and in it is 3 photographs of Reyner Banham naked sitting down, and 2 photographs or something like that, or 3 photographs of Francois sitting down naked, and like what looks like an incredibly elaborate hi-fi set.
Yeah, with a sort of Ferris wheel on the top.
And the proposal is that what we should live in are, like, somewhere there will be an air conditioning unit, and it will pump air into a double-walled, like, polythene bag, and we're going to live in that. And that environment, the temperature and humidity and light of that is going to be controlled by this air conditioning system. And then inside that, we're going to have a collection of gadgets providing us with, light, entertainment, cocktails, like all the needs of life. And that's going to be kind of deployable everywhere. And it's going to blow their minds, and it's going to be a whole new way of living. And he sort of proposes that suburbia is probably the most natural place for this. So there's going to be lots of them in like suburban lots, because you can like screen them off with trees. And then he sort of proposes that maybe, you'll go anywhere with it. Like maybe you take your Cadillac and you tow on the back, your super deco like power unit thing, and you take it out to the desert and you pop out your polythene bag, inflate it with the power of the car, and then you can just sit in perfect luxury in a polythene bag. Freedom. There's another couple of great illustrations. One is like this super exaggerated image of all the servicing of a house without the house there, which is good fun. And eventually he sort of proposes this house, which is like a permanent house, which is like a kind of energy platform with like solar panels and like all these sort of rays that like heat the air just openly, like there's no containment at all, heat and cool the air, and like there's a apparatus on a sort of stick that like attracts vermin and kills them. He's definitely been reading like Shearbart. It's this pure Shearbartian, like the Hoover is going to go around and kill all the flies and rats, it's like just suck them up, and you're going to be like heated by microwaves. And there's all this solar panel rack, and that's the house of the future. There's no house at all. It's just a techno tree. And I think we'll leave it there and say goodnight for now and be back next time. I think we'll unpack then where we think this comes from and where it's going and what happens to that particular idea.
So thanks a lot for listening. Remember, you can get access to our library of bonus episodes covering all sorts of interesting, related and unrelated topics.
For this one, I think we'll be doing a deep dive into the book of Los Angeles 4 Ecologies.
So you can get access to that and other interesting things like polls and stuff by subscribing to our Patreon at patreon.com/about_buildings.
Thank you, all of you who have.
Yeah, much appreciated. You can email us at aboutbuildingsandzities@gmail.com. I've got a couple of people I need to get back to. I'm sorry. I will hopefully have responded to you before the time this comes out. Our editor is Matthew Lloyd Roberts. Thanks to Matt. And we've got social media at about_buildings on various platforms. It's a big help to us if you can rate and review on Apple Podcasts or any other platform, because it helps other people to discover the show.
And makes us feel liked and wanted.
Yeah, that's nice as well. But it's you're finding that it's just what you're looking for will help someone else to make that glorious discovery. All right, so
good night. I hope you're all sitting comfortably under your microwave radiators, basking in the glow of the insect destroying laser system.
Yes, naked and hairy, of course.
Naked and hairy, yes, wriggling around
as the day you were born.
All
right, till next time.